If you Once again, welcome to our webinar. My name is Mike Bishop. I'm the managing director of the Community-Based Global Learning Collaborative. Super excited to have with us today Amanda Tapler and Matt Gendle, who will be talking about thinking critically about assessing CBGL program impacts for community partners. I know there are a lot of familiar faces here. Appreciate you all being here. And for the sake of folks who might be watching the recording, the collaborative is a network of educational institutions and community organizations, and we advance community-based global learning and research for more just, inclusive, and sustainable communities. This webinar series is one of our four main activities, along with our global engagement survey, our fair trade learning principles of ethical partnership, and our online curriculum called our Interdependence Toolkit. The collaborative has really been leaning into our ethical principles of partnership through a working group that Matt is a part of as a member of our steering committee. And so while there has been assessment of CBGL programs, the collaborative, and we are very interested in thinking about what this means for community partners. Much of the assessment is often student-centered, and we know less attention is paid to the needs, goals, and desires of our community partners. And our principles of ethical partnership that we call fair trade learning emphasizes the concept of dual purposes, where positive outcomes for CBGL programs and partner communities are reciprocal and equally valued. And so Amanda and Matt, really excited to have you. They will be offering this webinar that focuses on practical and equitable strategies to engage partners in the assessment of both positive and challenging partnership outcomes. We are recording this. And Amanda and Matt will introduce themselves, although I will say that Matt, as Dr. Gendle, is the outgoing director of Project Pericles, and Professor Tapler, as the incoming director of Project Pericles, both at Elon University, bring a wealth of knowledge to this topic. Longtime members of the collaborative, and just super excited that you're with us today. Matt, Amanda, take it away.
I'll start really quickly just to introduce myself. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining. So, yeah, as Mike said, Matt Gendle at Elon University. And I think the one thing that I want to share about myself at the outset is that when I entered this work, I had no particular training formally in doing this. So I've had to learn a lot along the way, and I'm learning a lot all the time. And so, don't feel as though at any point like if you're lost or if we say something that you've not heard before, like just ask, because that's how I got to the point where I am too, is just asking a lot of questions to a lot of people that were way smarter than me. So welcome.
Thanks, Matt. Hi, everyone. It's so nice to see you all and see so many people that I know your names, but I have not ever met you. Caitlin, Sam, Amanda Whitman. It's nice to see you again. Um, as Mike mentioned, I'm an associate teaching professor here at Elon University in public health, but I also serve alongside Matt with Project Pericles. And Mike had asked us to think about, how we found ourselves in this space. And my background in public health really came from working with community organizations right from the start. However, coming into academia and as a faculty member, was working less with community organizations until got back in probably the last several years with Project Pericles, and have worked with community partners both internationally and locally for many years now. But I think my roots were always in working with community organizations, but work with them a little bit differently than I had previously before coming to higher education. So glad to be here. Lots of us doing great work here and both working in partnerships and around assessment. So thank you for having us.
And just to get things rolling, we've worked with Mike to prepare a brief poll just to kind of get a temperature check and see where people are coming from. So, Mike, you want to go ahead and do the poll now?
Yes, that sounds great.
Thank you.
If you can hear me now, I'm going to launch the poll. There's two questions, so you should be able to see them both. And The first question, what is it about today's conversation that sparks your interest? And I think the second one should also appear, what sorts of resources would be helpful in your work with community assessment? So if you wouldn't mind responding to that, give you all 30 seconds or so, a minute, and then we'll look at the results. Awesome. Thank you all. A few more seconds, and then I'll close the poll. All right, let's take a look. And hopefully you should be able to see the results as well. And this also should be helpful for both Matt and Amanda for today's session. So seeing a lot about both the practical and equitable strategies, I did split those out to see if there was more interest in one or the other. And clearly there's interest in each of those ideas of practical and equitable strategies to engage community partners. Um, And so that's a noticing of mine. And then, wow, in that second question, people seem to be eager for both an off-the-shelf instrument and guidance. And if I should have mentioned, we are doing some of this work in our Fair Trade Learning action team. And I'm going to drop into the chat here in a moment a little bit more about the collaborative. But Matt, Amanda, anything you'd like to say about this before I stop sharing the results? All right. Right. So thank you all for giving us that information. That's really helpful. And I'm going to turn it back over to Matt and Amanda.
Thanks, Mike. So for the next little bit of time, we thought it would make sense to probably provide you with some overview of some of the key problems and issues that we've come across and others have as well related to assessment of community impact. And I think the big one, and Amanda, feel free to jump in at any point here. The big one I think is one that Mike brought up already, which is, in the work that we do as part of the collaborative, we're always thinking about those dual purposes again, right? So we're thinking about, not only how might our students or our institutions or whatever organization we're affiliated with, what benefit might be derived to them from these relationships, but also how is the community getting some benefit? And I think in the work that I've been doing in the collaborative with Mike and some other colleagues, some of whom are on this Zoom right now, I've been forced over the past couple of months to really refocus that a little bit and really be thinking about like how do we reframe all of this work in a non-colonial way so that we're not inadvertently continuing to think about like our community partners as some sort of like passive agents, right? Where like something is done to them, so it's not the case that like, oh yes, we're doing the thing and also the community partners happen to benefit from that, but rather instead be thinking about like how can we design stuff from the very beginning, whether we're talking about the project itself or assessment metrics or anything in between, where we're being real about the reality that these community members are equal stakeholders in this work. Because I think a lot of times we say that and we mean it, but then when it comes time to actualize the work, sometimes that doesn't always get like translated out in the ways that we intend.
Yeah, and I'm going to just jump in really quickly. And also, just thinking about how, multi-directional our work is. So thinking about, are we, we're working with students, we're working with other faculty, we're working with administration. We're also thinking about working with community organization, community partners, as well as with the community itself. And so as we think about assessment, there's lots of different layers of and places where we could assess. And for a long time, it's been assessing students and assessing for programmatic purposes and assessing at the institutional level. And I think one of the things that I learned early on in working with Eric Hartman was this dual purpose as well as fair trade learning, which sort of changed my way of thinking to recognizing the importance of understanding the values that my community partner and the community members themselves found in this relationship. What were the values? What were the assets? How were they being brought into the fold as it related to assessment, which helped to guide our work together? And I think that's what helped to really think about this co-creation place and really needing to take a step back and cede some of the power that we in academia sort of have in building these relationships, but also to understand that many times community partners, they don't come to our partnerships in the same way that we think of them in academia either. So many community partners aren't necessarily thinking about these power dynamics and how can I shape a syllabus or co-create from the beginning. And so I think um, even thinking about our own language and how we facilitate those partnerships and bring people in right from the beginning, recognizing that this is really important and it has the power to be transformative versus transactional if we co-create, if we collaborate, and it ends up being I think having a greater impact versus solely relying on what is the outcome of said experience. And it affords us maybe longer partnerships as well.
Before I go on, I would encourage anybody at any point to just raise their hand and pop in with questions, comments, because I want this to be much more of a discussion than like Amanda and I just sitting here and like yapping at you for an hour and a half, because that's not necessarily useful to anybody. One thing I will say, though, in immediate follow-up to something that Amanda brought up is, and I say this from a place of honesty and vulnerability, this whole notion of like how to navigate the power structures is something that I very much deal with, and I haven't really solved yet in my own sort of community relationships. So the organization that I work with in Sri Lanka, I've worked with them for a little over a decade now, and even though I enter that relationship, with open hands, open hearts in terms of like the kind of co-creation that we're wanting to talk about here today. I still struggle getting over or getting around the reality that that power dynamic is there, and that, I'm a foreign faculty member with an advanced degree who's in these communities and gets treated, despite my best intentions, in particular ways. And sometimes the way in which that operationalizes itself is folks will say yes to things that I'm not entirely certain are in their best interest, but I don't know what their best interest even is, right? But like, as far as I can divine it out to be, it doesn't seem like it's in their best interest, because it seems oftentimes like folks, want to make sure that that relationship is continued and that relationship is deepened over time. And I mean, I'm actually happy to take suggestions from any of you here today in this Zoom meeting if you've figured out ways to get around that, because it's something that I still really, really, really struggle with. People are just like, yeah, no, I don't got this either, which I suppose is okay. So does anyone have an example that they want to share of ways in which they have either succeeded or tried and maybe not had great success with like true co-creation with a community partner or group?
Matt, I could offer an example that might have some warts in it. So not a perfect example, maybe perfect in the sense that it has some of the mistakes I made in it, but very briefly, and some folks on the call, forgive me, but you've heard me talk about my time in post-Katrina New Orleans. And so this example is not so much working with one particular organization, but a group of organizations that we convened as a community advisory council. And we tried to be very particular about the term we called this group. And with this group that we started out doing 1 day service projects with, and I use that term service where we were doing uh, the labor of working in their gardens or painting their schools. And at a certain point, we wanted to extend that relationship beyond just 1 week in the year. And so we convened this advisory committee and said, what do y'all think about this idea of internships? It was something that they desired, and so we said, okay, for your time serving on our advisory committee, in return, we will provide you with a summer intern for 8 weeks. And so we tried to make it reciprocal in that you're giving us your time, and we're giving you hopefully a resource that will expand the operations of your organization. So that's one example where we tried to do some co-planning with that particular group of organizations that became somewhat formalized into an advisory committee.
Anyone else like to
I'm
share
just
anything?
gonna I'm just gonna jump on because
Oh, Sharon wants
Amanda
to share.
Whitman had put a couple of things in the chat about intention versus impact within assessment and thinking about or considering how difficult power and privilege is to work through. And just wanted to lift both of those up if you're looking at the chat or not, and say that absolutely. I also work internationally, like Matt. Have worked with an organization called the Comprehensive Rural Health Project in India. But I also work locally with the Women's Resource Center. I've worked with them for 25 years, maybe 26 years, and with the Comprehensive Rural Health Project for 16 years now. So both long-standing relationships that, uh, even though they're long-standing relationships, continue to navigate different power and privilege dynamics that exist. And I would say that each have their own challenges and have to continue to think about and work through. It's definitely not something that you can say, "Oh, I've figured this out. I've solved." The challenges of mitigating power and privilege. It's something that I think I always keep at the forefront and try to have conversations about because different contexts provide both different opportunities as well as different challenges. And I'll give an example of one where internationally, working with the Comprehensive Rural Health Project. When I first started working with them, maybe a year or two in, it was offered to my group that if they'd like to do homestays within the community, they could arrange that with village health workers. And I thought through that. I wrestled with that a little bit. I thought this would be a great opportunity for my students. And yet, the village health workers and I have only spent a little bit of time together, a couple of years. And I went back to the director and I said, I really think that this will come to fruition when the village health workers are ready to invite my students into their homes. That's a really personal experience. And me and my students coming from the US, and the director wanting to offer this experience to my students was wonderful, but it definitely was coming from a place of me holding power and privilege and them wanting to give my students maybe everything, every experience that they could. But this was a very vulnerable place to be in. People were able to be in village health workers' homes, and yet had that been considered or discussed with village health workers? And it ended up being about 5 years after I had been going regularly, both in January and in the summer, that several village health workers actually came to me and said, "We'd love to have your students come and stay with us. Would they be interested in staying, overnight? How could this work?" And so we actually got together with the director, with several other staff of this organization, as well as with the village health workers, and talked through how might we make this opportunity come to fruition. But that was based on trust. It was based on open, conversations. Clearly, they were not feeling they weren't, that level of vulnerability had been mitigated to some degree. But also, we were able to think about, it costs money to have a visitor overnight into communities where it's hard to put food on their table for their own family. So you add one more mouth or three mouths to that table, that can be a pretty big expense. So how do we mitigate that expense as well? So, you know, taking a pause and not just jumping on that opportunity and thinking about the pros and the cons, both for the community members as well as for us, really helped me, I think, manage that place of power and privilege. But it takes a lot of time for us to reflect on our own power and privilege. And if we're not constantly doing that, it's hard to see where these places and spaces exist, and then begin to think about how we might work through them, and what does working through them actually look like. And different contexts are going to look differently. I don't know if that was helpful, but
Yeah, Sharon, please.
Yeah, I think that's, excuse me, I think that's very helpful, because one of the things that I found in doing this kind of work, both being based at, the University of Missouri, Columbia, and then here being in Chicago through the University of University Theological School, is the difference between, it's so important in getting honest feedback and co-creation to be aware of power dynamics. And so often I wasn't aware of them, and people calling them out. But again, in addition to the power dynamics, being addition to cultural dynamics on how honest feedback and critique is given. And one of the things that we found, which was really revealing for me when I was at the University of Missouri, was in some communities that we worked with, people given the opportunity for direct feedback and critique was welcome, and others culturally, that's not just how different views are shared. And I am really incompetent of finding different ways of getting that feedback. So like a straightforward assessment. And one of the things I really appreciated in the article that the two of you wrote with your colleague is, okay, there might be a power imbalance in terms of so few people answered and maybe given more positive answers because they want to keep the relationship going. But how do we create a culture? Oh, that's not, okay, this is my last point. So how do we not, in a colonialist way, create a culture where critical feedback is a sign of growth? And giving critical feedback in just our way isn't the only way of doing it. And I'm interested if other people have found, with different cultures and different groups, there are different ways and forms of getting that. And of course, like Kramer, you were saying, Amanda, it takes time and openness.
Yeah, Manuel, what would you like to add?
Hello, everybody. I'm from Italy, so I work for a study abroad institute in central Italy, and I manage all the community engagement initiatives for this school. So openness and time are two very important words in my job, at least for my experience. I just give you two examples, one on a good way and another one on not a bad way, but it's not the thing that I want to be. So basically, we work with the Solidarity Purchasing Group. So long story short, is an association of consumers who buys directly from local and small producers. We have this course in sustainable alternative food systems in Italy. So we build up, like we started 3 years ago with a service learning project. And we brought, and this is our overall approach, we brought the community partner inside the co-creation of the project. So this means that even when we started thinking of what the students could be with this association, the partner, the president, and the other members of the board were inside the discussion. And openness was very useful. At the beginning, you can think that this can create issues, but it takes time. But to be open, it means that everybody knows the expectations from different sides. So, and the project changes according to the feedback of everybody. So it's a consistent assessment, because it's always a dialogue. On the other hand, we have courses in business and marketing, and I feel that in that case, even so, when you do projects that last 1 or 2 semesters, you cannot build up knowledge and mutual understanding. So I feel that those type of projects, at least in my perception, are more on the consultant side of doing community engagement, and less in the field of the co-creation of projects and knowledge. So I just wanted to share you one good example and one quote unquote bad example. So
Thank you.
thank you. Thank you.
And I wanted to share something and follow up to what Sharon said. And again, I'm like, I don't want to sound like a Debbie Downer here, but I think like sometimes I wonder if we're trying to like reach for a brass ring that we can't ever quite get at. Because so, in my work in Sri Lanka, the organization that I work with, they work through self-organized, self-actualized, like hyper local village societies. And the way that feedback is given culturally within those village societies is they have what are called family meetings. Now, it's not a meeting of a genetic family, it's a meeting of the people that are in that society, right? And so I will typically take part in those when I'm there, and my students will as well if there were as well. And it's very clear to me that just our presence there changes the entire dynamic of those family meetings. And again, these are people that know me. I've worked with them before. I have no reason to appear in any way threatening to them. I have in every way that I've been able to tried to convey to them, that I'm here to learn and critical feedback is, robustly welcomed. And yet, I don't get the feeling that that actually happens. And I don't know how to bust through that. So I think, Sharon, you're absolutely right. Like, figuring out what the cultural norms are is the first and probably most important step. But that in and of itself may not get you to where you maybe want to go. It's just it's so tricky and frustrating, I think.
I'm just going to add one more thing. So even, Sharon, you mentioned our article and, the community benefit scale as it is, Matt was able to use it with Sarvodia. I actually have used it a little bit different way with the Comprehensive Rural Health Project, in part because of the differences in context. And so when I was talking to the directors of the organization, as well as to some of their community outreach team members, they were talking about how this might be a great assessment, but even looking at the very first question, which was around economic value, they said that community partners don't have any understanding of what economic value would be. And so even looking at that tool, we picked and we sort of took several things out of there, or we sort of manipulated it a little bit, to still be able to ask questions that got to those survey, or to that scale. But economics was not one of them that was, something that they wanted to ask about. The other thing that they asked was that they implemented this 1 to 3 weeks after we left, so that that would help to mitigate some of the power that we might unintentionally or play in the community members answering, because we were still, while we might not have been present when the team was implementing the survey, they knew we were local. They knew we were still there. And so they wanted to wait until we had left to ask community members. And then we got back together as a team and talked about the results. Didn't publish that information. Again, small group, much like Matt's, but a different process, thinking about the cultural practices and what was really beneficial for the community in regards to implementing a survey such as that. And yet, on the flip side, when I look at my work with the Women's Resource Center, they're so used to assessment. They, for them, looking and having an assessment and then being brought into the discussion seems like an honor. Like, oh, you're asking me what is beneficial, what I might want to do. I want to actually come into your class. I want to talk to your students. They were given an opportunity that they hadn't otherwise had. So I appreciate you bringing those. That's all to say, I appreciate you bringing in the questions and the comments around culture and context.
And those of you who have been able to attend to the chat as well, Sarah Stanlick a few minutes ago made a really interesting point about consent. Sarah, is there anything you want to add to that or elaborate on that at all? Because I think that's really, really critical.
Yeah, well, I was thinking a bit about the best types of relationships I've had with community partners, and it is one where you are continually checking in. Is this still okay? Do we have the same understanding of how to move forward? What went wrong? And it's not as labor oriented or burdensome as sometimes like institutional, like IRB and things will enforce upon you, right? Sometimes that feels cold, it feels impersonal. Everybody has talked at length about relationships, but the ability to have, I would have burrito dates with my partner at my last institution, and we would just like reflect and say, how are things going? What are the things that are missing the mark? And then if you have that type of relationship and trust, people will tell you when things are going off the rails or uncomfortable, and they have the agency to say no. And I think more than anything, that's a sign of a good partnership, when they fully know that they can tell you no, and you're going to keep a strong relationship and keep working together.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I want to add to that too. I think complicated by it depends on the kind of relationship that you're hoping, or the kind of partnership, right? Some partnerships are meant to be far more transactional. And so they can say no, and all that means is it means that your students aren't going to go build the playground or aren't going to go serve the soup or whatever kind of the service is, right? And that's okay. And so I think it's also really important to think about like all of this is on that spectrum of the kinds of partnerships, right? These deep, trusting burrito date partnerships, which is your new TM, Sarah. Like it is a kind of partnership that some of us are eager to do. It is not the only kind of partnership that I think all of us are involved in our institutions, right? And so I think it's also being really able to say, which is why I loved the point around multiple forms of assessment. Like you have to have a whole bag of tricks in order to deal with where your partners are, the kinds of partnerships that you're hoping to like be in relationship with, right? So I don't know, I think it complicates it when we're talking about like, oh, I wish I had a tool, or oh, I wish I had a process, because it's not a one kind of size fits all, depending on the kind of relationship and you may be like, you have your personal research relationships, and those are different than the ones that you're overseeing as part of because you're the director of a program where students are being sent out on a regular basis to work with, right? So like, I think as individuals in those boundary spanning roles, we sometimes have to be like, okay, what's the right approach for this that may not work in this other space that we also inhabit and that our partners inhabit, right? So I don't know, makes me think.
Amanda, that was such great points as always. It's good to see you. And I want to lift that up. And I think a lot of the work that Matt and I do and kind of wrestle with is try to create tools that can be manipulated based on or tailored based on the different types of work that you're doing. Because, I think even to Manuel's point of, the short-term versus long-term relationships, you might have you might have a community partner for one semester, you might have them for a year, you might have them for many years. And there's still great value in thinking about how to mitigate power imbalances as well as to ensure that that's a mutually beneficial place to and coming from like a really asset-based place, and that there is opportunities to co-create even with shorter partnerships. But when it comes to assessing, you do have to sort of pick and choose, and there's not lots of assessment tools out there. And I think what Matt and I have tried to do is make them readily available and then as flexible as they can so that you can use pieces or parts to assess, and knowing, the type of relationship that you have should ultimately guide how you use assessment, whether that be storytelling, whether it be a formal assessment, whether it be, you're assessing as well as your community partners assessing. How do those relationships work, and how do you use those assessment tools to get the greatest benefit out of them, or to meet your needs? Each of you come here with different needs of why you want to assess and what you're trying to assess. And so how do you use these tools to benefit the collective?
And I would like to move us to talk about some of the existing measures that are out there in just a second. But before we do that, I do want to build up on one other point. I mean, I'm happy to hear today so much of us talking about trust building and how this takes time and we have to be authentic in doing that. And I want us to shift our lens just for a second and think about internally within our own institutions and organizations, the kind of trust that we have to build inside in order for all of this to work. And so for me specifically, because I work at a university, I think a lot about how to build that trust between myself and the senior leadership that I report to. And this is sort of fresh in my mind right now because I'm not going to go into details other than to say our organization that Amanda and I run have a relationship with our local indigenous community. We had over time created an agreement with them, meaning the indigenous partners, where the partners were going to do a thing on their land that was related to our programming, and we were going to fund it. And very much trying to follow the model that we're talking about here is you let the partner lead. The partner has the space to decide what's best for them and what's right for them, and they do things on their own time scale and their own framework and all that stuff. And yet, because it was Elon's money that was funding this, we had associate VPs that still felt like they could have veto power over every little thing. Now, I think we have to distinguish that from, like, obviously, if something is ethically problematic or harmful to our students, of course, they should have veto power over that sort of thing. This was not one of those cases. This was something that, the tribe should have entire power to determine for themselves how this happens. And yet, my VP was, I'm not going to do it. It was a problem. It was a problem. And so I don't know if folks have any examples of things that they've done successfully to sort of gain that trust and that understanding amongst their senior leaderships, or even just to get your senior leaders to move their mindset away from being solely like student focused. And like, let me be clear, like I get this, right? Like that's what they're paid to do. Like our senior leaders, our provosts, our VPs, it's not their job necessarily to raise up our community partners and focus on them. They're being paid to watch out for our students and watch out for their programs. And I get that. But at the same time, I think we need to figure out ways to get them to also understand, if not move them fully to the idea of dual purposes, as Mike talked about earlier, at least get them to understand that it's not appropriate for them to be controlling or, thinking as though they have veto power over every little thing just because it's a university partnership and it involves university students.
I guess I'm going to jump in for just a quick second. So along those lines, Matt, yeah, I mean, our work here at Binghamton University with Haudenosaunee communities, particularly the Onondaga Nation, is one in which, we've always understood it not just to be, it started out as how we build partnerships and relationships and honoring specifically an indigenous model of what's called the two Oroga these two pathways that non-indigenous indigenous peoples follow, which goes back to the 1613 treaty. So we started with those conversations to begin with. So it's more like how do we recognize or acknowledge our communities without using a statement specifically? And part of that led to it was included, I should say, it wasn't just about students doing community engaged learning experiences or going to the Onondaga Nation to do service experiences, but it's also about research partnerships. It was also about all levels of universities building those partnerships and relationships. So we have a new president, just started about a month ago. So we're looking to see what kind of support the new president brings with her. Because in the past, our previous president got that and was very supportive of we would have a large Haudenosaunee festival that surrounded our annual Three Sisters Garden Harvest, as well as the planting that takes place as another event. But what we continue to do is many kind of curricular and co-curricular experiences as possible. Now, part of the funding for that has come from the Office of the President, but others have come from every corner of the university. So the quote unquote buy-in is because we have student affair grants. We have deans in different colleges providing funds for this. So there's no like complete oversight and gatekeeping perspective, but also those of us as faculty and staff who are applying for those grants, clearly they have to have within them a certain kind of outcome that's related to research or to learning. And so in that context, we haven't run up into that yet. I'm hoping we don't. I'm not planning on that, but Matt, that's a good point to bring because I could always see that happening down the road. And not to getting too into the weeds, but I wanted to sort of step back about the cultural context of things in these relationships. And starting really with work I've been doing with Shuar communities in the Ecuadorian Amazon, I'm just going to share a recent article that came out this year about kind of a broader decade plus long relationship building. But I was getting back and thinking about we've yet to sort of frame this in terms of actually a formal kind of assessment of the relationship. But what it led to was indigenous ways of knowing and utilizing their models for everything that we do, just in terms of why we're there, what we're doing. The kind of feedback comes more from us integrating into the work that they're doing, and particularly in the case of the Shuar, there's a term called Minga. It's really a Quechua Indian term for communal doing everything. So work, relationships, learning. That's their model of how things happen. It's also their model of essentially assessment of belonging. What it means to be part of a Minga is being part of a community project. And their assessment in the context of whether something's successful or not is the success of the Minga. But we've turned this into the learning experience of the students as well as the service work that they're doing, and ultimately the research outcomes of that work are all tied to this broader indigenous way of knowing around Minga specifically. And so that's partly what this article talks about, but also goes a little further. So it kind of builds into another kind of, I guess we could frame this in a Western concept of assessment. It's something called the Rintrikamaji, which basically, in the Shuar term, is united we are stronger. So when they speak of that specific Shuar term, they mean that our experience have made us and of us all stronger. We have all developed, and not just in terms of development of the community, but development as individuals. And so each time that we have conversations each year about the outcomes of each experience, it's framed within, now we've come to frame everything in terms of planning, in terms of outcomes, in terms of these larger indigenous models of understanding or indigenous ways of knowing. Now, what we're looking into right now is there's been a shift in the administration, and Matt, that's what's kind of set off my kind of red flare, was that they're looking at this experience differently than they've done in the past. So there was quite a shift that happened where the administration decided to embed some of the mission side of the university, which was not ever part of the course. It crosses all boundaries of not only sort of faculty understandings, but those of you who work at maybe faith-based institutions, there are places for that kind of experience, but it's not in the classroom, and unless that's the class itself. And so we ran into this just this last summer. So now we're in a place where we're talking with community partners, sort of reassess. Their concern is that there's been a shift in leadership at our university in terms of that which supported the specific trip. And now in terms of bringing in and crossing over into a mission ideology, essentially, that was never there before, but the mission office feels it needs to be there to support the students going. So anyway, that's still to be determined. That's for, I guess, one of our future community-based global learning initiative conferences, et cetera, to talk about. But I wanted to come back to what I first mentioned, and that's our partnership with the Haudenosaunee nations. And similarly, in that case, we're using this indigenous model of a partnership of a living treaty responding around this two-row wampum or gaswenta. Mike knows this very well. I mean, it's been part of his whole career work, but I'm bringing it up in part because it does become a model not only of ways that we do things, but really the understanding of the outcomes and the relationship of a living treaty is that we're meant to work in terms of two different paths, but yet we crossed over into context of friendship, peace, and respect, and forever. And so that within itself embeds a sense of really assessment when all said and done. Again, and using indigenous ways of knowing as well. So I'm excited in the future, and Mike, I'd love to hear your context of this, and we can talk this at some other point too. But I'd love to see ways that we can bring in sort of local knowledge, indigenous ways of knowing, in terms of being part of an assessment, but not in the traditional sense of we think of assessment protocols. It's more about embedding in within their ways of knowing and ways of understanding and really ways of defining success and outcomes as well. So for the Haudenosaunee, us upholding the living treaty in of itself is the primary, I guess, goal or outcome of that success that we're doing in such a ways that, that's not only mindful with humility, that we move forward in terms of building all these partnerships with the university, but it's also understood that we're doing it within this responsibility of holding up to a living treaty that really is forever. And what that means is that we show that through our actions, and similarly, that comes back in terms of our feedback of the experiences. So anyway, I didn't want to go on too long about that, but just wanted to bring that up, sort of overlapping, Matt, your concern that came out, but also I think it's just the broader sort of cultural context of things. So thank you.
Thank you. I think what we can do now is in just a second, we can move into some breakout groups. Before we do that, just really, really briefly, I wanted to point out again to folks, and I believe these resources were provided to you in some of the early material that Mike sent out related to today's event. To the best of my knowledge, there are really two existing sort of off-the-shelf scales to do this kind of work. So there's one that Amanda and I created with a colleague of mine in Sri Lanka. And then there's also the TRES, which I know has been around for a while, that Carol Clayton and colleagues have been involved in creating, and they're constantly revising it and upgrading it. So those of you that came here today looking primarily for sort of like off-the-shelf solutions, those are pretty much what we've got as far as I'm aware. I think the challenge, though, and this is something I didn't necessarily fully realize until I really got deeply embedded in this work, is that this is certainly one of those cases where the one size fits all instrument model is just not going to work. It just doesn't. I mean, even, and I think Amanda sort of alluded to this a little bit earlier. While I certainly am in no way embarrassed by the instrument that we created, like now that we're sitting 18 months after the fact, 2 years after, I'm kind of like, yeah. There's definitely a lot of improvements that could be made to the point where I don't know that I'd even make a revision of it. I probably would make something new. It worked okay for the particular context in Sri Lanka and the particular needs that I had in Sri Lanka with that particular partner at that time. But in terms of more broad utility, I mean, I'll leave that up to you to decide. But I certainly, I feel like trying to spend a ton of time and effort to make one single thing that's going to work well for all people in all relationships and all cultural contexts, that's just silly. That's just not going to work. So I would certainly encourage all of you to be thinking about can you make your own assessments, be they qualitative or quantitative, and what would that look like, and how can you bring in your partners as co-authors in that work, because I think that's probably the better way to approach it. And I know Mike and I and the other folks that are involved in this working group that he mentioned earlier within the collaborative are having a lot of these really rich conversations right now about how can we do a both and, where we can say, okay, here are a bunch of best practice models, here's some theoretical and philosophical underpinning about how you do this, and then here's some very real examples like what Amanda and I did or what Carol Clayton has done to show these are some ways in which you could do it, but also don't hold these things up as this is the be all end all best example in all the world ever. So with that being said, Mike, do you want to break us up into discussion groups? We've got two questions that we can, I think, ponder a little more deeply, and it might be easier to do in the smaller group setting.
Yeah, happy to do that. And I put the two questions in the chat. And of course, Matt will be in one room, Amanda will be in the other. And so hope folks are able to stick around, engage in that conversation. And we will come back and do some other large group sharing. And so these are starting points, right? These questions. Um, and so I will open up
Mike,
the,
can I interrupt just a second? It looks like we're just down to 9 people now,
yeah,
not including us. So if that's the case, I think we can probably stay in one group if
sounds
that
good.
works. Whatever I did to drive all the people off, I apologize.
I think a lot of people had 2 o'clock appointments, so I can appreciate that.
So yeah, I guess we can just start an open-ended conversation with that first question that Mike put in the chat. So how might we engender robust self-examination around the question of whether academic programs are operating in equitable or paternalistic ways? And again, this is something that's just been driving me crazy lately. I mean, in part to get back to something that Barrett said earlier, one of the struggles that I've had in my own particular institutional context here at Elon is if I'm going to get to a point, like if we think about our indigenous partnership, if I'm going to get to a point where we're going to be able to do the kinds of things that Barrett's talking about, I first have to get my senior administration to understand the cultural differences that are at play here. And I'm just not there yet. I mean, to the point where I have had a couple situations in meetings where the sort of differences of knowing and differences in understanding cross culturally that exist have been turned around back on me by people that are not part of that culture. Again, that particular vice president that I mentioned earlier, he did this to me twice in two different meetings where we were talking about something that was entirely internal to Elon, related to strategic planning, related to the way in which we work as an institution. It had nothing to do with the partner per se. And I got to like, well, Matt, that's not the indigenous way of knowing, because he wanted to shut the conversation down. And I really struggle with, moving folks away from that kind of thinking where it almost becomes like this notion of recognizing differences becomes weaponized in a way to like just promote the same old colonialist ideology that we've had all along. So yeah, let's start with that question. Like how do we self-examine around what we're really doing and why, and how to be more equitable and less paternalistic?
Or is it that how do we self-examine, or how do we help others around us self-examine? Because I feel like this group of folk is doing the work to self-examine.
Yeah,
But
it might be useful to go with that
like,
second. How do we help others, perhaps?
yeah.
Although I think, Amanda, that's part of the answer. I mean, there's a lot of different aspects to the answer, but is it staying within our institutions that have been founded with a dominant way of looking at the world? And we can maybe affect our institutions up to a point. I mean, my friend Spencer Lyons said we can decolonize institutions up to a point, and then we need to start indigenizing them. And if we're not even making any inroads in decolonizing them, so it strikes me, Amanda, like, are there third spaces like this, right? Like, is it through associations, whatever your disciplinary association might be or sector association, where it lends itself to both further self-examination, which I always need, and also what does this look like in an institution that does not value consent or does not value humility, maybe as much as I would like? So I think it's striking me, and not only because I work with the collaborative, but I just wonder if like a third space is useful that's not the community, so to speak, or not the institution, but a space like this where we can ponder questions out loud and not get reprimanded or worse for doing that.
Yep, please, Sharon, go ahead.
Yeah, Mike, to both affirm that and then a question. How do we get people into that kind of experience? Because I think some people, and we've said this before, not necessarily bad intention, genuinely do not know that there are multiple ways of knowing. They think there's one, and that there are multiple ways of expressing care and multiple ways of enact. They don't know that. They can't imagine it. And that's across the political spectrum. And again, how crucial my entire life when I was at Harvard Divinity School, I was part of a group that was founded as Enlightenment. It was theologians, Yale, Harvard, Princeton, who are changing theological education to look at enlightenment thinking, liberal thinking. And then they brought in people like me and others. Well, there's not liberal, there's liberation, right? And changing that whole thing. And so having groups like this, the Engagement Scholarship Consortium, and again, the kind of thing of what I've learned about in terms of very different Indigenous ways of knowing is the time that it takes, but people who have never had that experience, how do you get them the experience? And one of my colleagues, you might have read his work, Willie James Jennings, Actor Whiteness and Education and Belonging. I knew him when he was at Duke, he's now at Yale. And it just talks about that whole thing of possession, control, and mastery, and how that affects even those of us who have in some ways been marginalized. And what it takes to get this glorious energy of non-knowing. And I genuinely do not know how. And again, in my experience from being just, professor to department chair, they've been provost. I know how to do it with students. I know how to do it with people like you, but with others who have that kind of mindset, I do not know how to help them see a different way. And I hope I'd be eager to hear stories of some of you too. And I'll just telling one thing is helpful. Sometimes I found it helpful, like telling my own stories of learning. I was at the University of Missouri when I was teaching a class. We didn't have the term yet, womanism, but with on feminism and with my colleagues was African American, and we'd come up with one session that we were going to have divide the students because the racial division was just white and black. We were going to divide them, and it was me there saying, "All right, let's get together." The black students here, the white students here. Me saying it was like an insult, as though those voices don't want to be heard. Rather than if she had offered it, it would have been an invitation. All right. And so I'll tell that story, hoping, like by sharing my mistakes, that might help other people see that they could be making similar ones. But I don't know if that's really made a difference or not.
Tierney, you kind of sparked something that I learned early on in my time working at CRHP, in that I'm often thinking, because of where I work and the spaces that I'm in, when I think of education, and I think about even when I'm thinking about assessment, I'm often thinking about working with people who are in higher education or who are students who are in academia. And one of the things that my students often leave CRHP with is the understanding that, wow, there are so many people that have levels of education that we don't even acknowledge because we look solely for a degree. And yet everybody has the ability to learn. Everybody, we have lay health professionals that can, internationally, who may not be able to read and write, but they can deliver babies and they can mitigate the consequences of maternal and child health because they have learned what those risk factors are. They have built relationships with their communities and their people, and they are that trust and that relational context, which I think we often neglect to tap into as we think through all of these pieces and parts. And just so I bring that up just to say, like, just valuing the different ways in which we learn, the different ways in which we see education, and how we have the potential to interact and relate to one another. And I think it goes back to maybe some of the things that Barrett was saying around cultural humility, and do we see that as something that's a lifelong process? And part of that is then continuing to self-reflect, but also to engage it with others to reflect, and to reflect with us. And how we do that varies greatly. So if all I'm thinking about is assessing by way of a survey, Then if I'm working with my community members at CRHP, I better be thinking about storytelling and song and dance because that's how they're going to tell their story. That is how I'm going to know whether or not things are working. And that is how they're going to learn and express. And so have I taken a step back and said, I need to be able to look at their lens and look at the way in which that's articulated, which I think speaks to some of what you were saying. Again, I don't think there's a one size fits all. But it's a constant process, right? And a constant questioning and a constant reflection. And if we're not doing that, it's problematic. But I also think that there's people who we may never be able to move the lever. Um, and if I spend all my time trying to focus on those people, then I lose the people in the middle. I lose the people who are thinking about leaning in, that are maybe wanting to reflect, wanting to engage with us, and to talk about these various places and spaces of power dynamics and privilege and shifts in way in which we can work together and across differences. If I focus on those that are really standing strong to their own beliefs, I feel like I give them the power. And so I have to sort of reframe that for myself of thinking about those bringing those people into our conversations that are maybe at that middle ground. And that's just my thoughts.
Barrett, were you going to say something earlier?
Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to note that I think some of the ways I even think about our partnership here at Binghamton, a lot of it, I can't speak for the different administrators, but I don't know to what degree they're thinking about performative actions and optics. And this is true, I think, of all global learning experiences or even locally, how administrators like that. They like the numbers. Our students are out in the community doing X, Y, Z, but I don't know what we're talking about. Do they get what that is in terms of impact, in terms of social change, et cetera? It's just sort of an optics and thing. So, I mean, that's for me, the assessments that we do that are often required. And I'm thinking now here, like in the domestic side in the Binghamton area, that we have to produce each year. I'm never quite sure that our past president really ever got what we did in our citizenship engagement for sure, and the different layers. I mean, somebody was mentioning just what does it mean to do critical community engaged learning, for example. I don't think they understand that from either a conceptual or intellectual perspective, or even in terms of what is cultural humility, and that's in of itself. So I'm just bringing that up because I think it's an important conversation. I see that a challenge for all of us. I also see a challenge in terms of who's doing the work, who is the person that's leading the students, for example. I mean, I love this group because there's so many of you that, run these bridge organizations that make the connections with the university and the community and have those partnerships for decades in many cases, which is wonderful. But I know I'll just give you an example here at Binghamton. Even before I came 8 years ago, they had a wonderful program in Cusco. Each summer that students go to, they could learn Quechua as well as, of course, it was a Spanish related course, culture in the Andes. But who made a lot of those connections was a long-term, multi-year, I think over a decade, adjunct faculty member who had other things in their lives, but made those connections, had those connections, and ran this program for a very, very long time. A new provost came in and says, we can't have adjuncts doing this work anymore. So right now, you can't be an adjunct and run these programs. Now, for a lot of institutions, but his reasoning for that was about optics and trying to get higher rankings in terms of like Carnegie. We're R1 research intensive institution at Binghamton. We're one of the research centers of the SUNY system. It just made me, and still it makes me angry to think that then overrode the importance of a community partnership, ultimately. Or even the whole optics behind, we'd have to look at the strengths across the university, and it could be staff. So now, the past 8 years, I retired. I've shifted to a more staff position. So yeah, I do push things a lot more. I still kind of act like a faculty member, but also realize I have limitations as just a staff member. So far, I've been allowed to do pretty much what I would do as a faculty member, but I know there are limits put onto that. But a lot of that comes back to, again, the university has other measurements or optics they want to show with respect to in our case at Binghamton, a Research One intensive university, which again, that's another thing that I just wanted to pop in there because I think that is also a challenge in terms of how universities even look at partners that we may be working with that make that bridge. Who's this, third party? What do you call them that you're working with? Yeah, you can show them the website. You can take this as a great organization, have all these relationships, but to them, like, well, why aren't we doing that then? And again, it's like this whole broader education about what this work is and how this work has transformed. But I guess I'm just speaking somewhat with frustration because I don't see that moving in a direction that it should have been moving for the past many decades, actually. I see it actually moving in other areas where you getting back to sort of the numerical counting of the ranking of the university, et cetera, et cetera. And it's going to be more so competitive, as we know, because the population shrinking of first year students. So I'm not sure what that means, but I think that challenge comes back to probably more pressure on how we look at the way that we, in some ways, can provide that data through the assessments. But that doesn't mean we can't continue to look at sort of multiple views and ways of knowing in that data in terms of getting those assessments. And maybe there's one that we're promoting and sending upstairs to administrator, but at the same time, there's the ones that we use to keep the work going and that we work with our communities around that. So anyway, that was just sort of a comment I wanted to briefly throw in there, Matt. Thank you.
Yeah,
So,
Oh, go ahead, please. I'm sorry.
Oh, if you're gonna respond, Matt, about that, my comment is a little bit different. Okay. Yeah, so something that I'm thinking about in these questions about like equitable or paternalistic partnerships, is that when I think about these types of international partnerships, I think that reaching for that equity, the equitable piece, or like truly equitable, is just impossible. Like that's not what I'm actually aiming for. I think the power dynamics are so great. I think like even if you think about like managed a program in South America in Colombia for a while, like even the difference in like the dollar conversion, it's just so great. Um, that like what I'm aiming for is mutually beneficial partnerships. And like what I'm most interested in for assessment is to know like, I have these same frustrations that or like concerns that a lot of people brought up when I would do, the end of the year survey or whatever, that they were like so positive. And well, like I want some critical feedback so that we can like improve this partnership. But there's also the aspect there that like the partners do value the partnership and want it to continue, right? So like why? What like I'm interested in what specific aspects of the partnership the partners are like that they value the most, and like how do we like build on those um and continue with those. So yeah, that's kind of a framing that I think more about the mutually beneficial than the truly equitable.
One of the things I'm sitting here thinking about, and what I'm suggesting would drive my admin batty, and they probably would refuse to do it because of the time sink of it. But nevertheless, I think it might be a good exercise. So and I imagine other institutions do this as well. So Elon geographically, we sort of exist at this intersection of like rural, suburban, and urban. And the community of Elon, not the university, but the town, it's an incorporated town in North Carolina. The university, far and away, is the largest landowner in that town. And of course, because we're not for profit, we don't pay taxes. So what that means is that then burden gets shouldered by Amanda and other people that actually live in the town. And so one of the ways in which the university has tried to get around that perception of like, oh, we're like freeloading on the back of the people that actually live here, is they produce this annual impact statement for the community. And it's a document that has like, how many millions of dollars went into local stores and stuff from the students spending money, and how many hours of service that however you want to define that our students did in local areas. I'm wondering like if there's any possible way that I could convince my administrative colleagues to actually say, rather than just gather that data passively, is to actually go out in the community and like ask, for example, the Chamber of Commerce, like, what value do you think are we to the institute or to the town? Or go to our community partners and say, of what value are we to you? And have them answer the questions. Now again, that's probably going to get you feedback that the president and the provost aren't going to want to put in a glossy pamphlet and fly around with. But I think it's going to actually get us closer to the kind of stuff that Caitlin's talking about, where you're getting like actual feedback that's useful and is not just like this quantitative dollar amount or, you know, number of hours served or that sort of thing.
Matt, can I jump in? And I think Caitlin, another thing I would just, in terms of resources, I guess I would just lift up the community engagement and partnership inventory that Matt and I created, not to use in its formality, but maybe to look through for some guiding questions and thoughts as I feel like I do this all the time. Use these as a guide as I think about what is mutually beneficial, and then just engage in those conversations loosely, not formally using this assessment necessarily, but always kind of come back to some of these questions. And some of them I can go deeper in because the relationships have been longer, or based on what we're working on or what we're doing lets me dive a little bit deeper. So I might just encourage you to take a look at that inventory and think if that helps you at least frame some of your questions or your thinking, because I do think it helps you to think not just about mutual benefit, but also equity.
I mean,
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. I mean, I think the inventory is very useful and super like meaningfully thought out. And yes, I think what you're saying to like use pieces of it or use it in ways that fit your needs could be really useful.
I mean, this is making me think again about how until we put capital in the hands of our community partners, right? Like, then there will continue to be this power imbalance. And so I think about how special it was when a community partner, when I was at UC Berkeley, worked with us on developing an assessment tool. And this individual was a partner of ours. She happened to be in the education sector, so a lot of the questions were around education. Um, and I would, if I had a chance to do that again, I would say, oh, we need to compensate that individual. So I think short of, compensating a group of community partners to help us design a tool, and whether our partners could also help us deploy that tool, even if the tool is listening to the stories of community partners, which I think can be very moving. So to me, that seems like one of the horizons for this work is not only including partners in breaking down the barriers when it comes to equity and partnerships, and I'm looking at the second question that we put into the chat around enhancing equity in program design, execution, evaluation. Of course, the question is like, well, why are we paying those folks, right? We have staff to do this. So to Barry's point, um, so I do think that's again a part of the answer. There's so many parts to this, but that's one small part to it.
And Patrick just put an important point in the chat here as well, about, oftentimes, we think about benefit in one way, whereas our community partners may, as Patrick is talking about, value their role as educators. And I think for me, that is yet another area that I think I have struggled with, not because I don't believe that, of course I do, but more so the issue becomes yet again convincing others that I have to report to that yes, it is completely okay and appropriate to cede a certain amount of control over syllabi, over programs, that sort of thing, to our partners. What Patrick says has also been my experience working in Sri Lanka. And I kind of keep it under my hat a little bit, I think, because the few times that I've brought this up that like, yeah, we don't entirely always know what it is exactly that we're doing when we go to Sri Lanka because the partners are the ones that are largely creating the quote unquote syllabi and then sharing it with me. Like that blows like the people that I report to's mind sometimes. Like, how can you go and not know exactly and blah, 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 blah. And you're the faculty and you're supposed to be in charge of all of this. And it's like, no, that's not how we do it. So I kind of keep it to myself a lot of time and I'm embarrassed about that because I think it's a really important story to share. But I don't necessarily feel at liberty to do so all the time. Another thing I wanted to point out is very, very early on in the chat, probably almost 45 minutes or so ago now, Robin from CFHI, and she's had to leave, she put in the chat some descriptions of how they in their organization try to be really mindful and intentional about compensation. So, for example, she had talked about how during COVID, she or they compensated community partners because they were not going to be engaged with them, but it was a way in which to maintain that partnership over time. And I think that's another area for at least those of us that are operating in traditional academic spaces. Like we have a lot of work to do in that respect. And part of it, just frankly comes down to money. Like I would love to compensate my partners in that way. I just don't have a draw account to do that with. But maybe we need to figure out ways in which we can change institutional culture in such a way so that we do have those resources available to us.
I also just wanted to jump in and lift up again what, Patrick, you were noting about community partners as primary educators. And I think this also speaks to maybe what Barrett was mentioning earlier with having adjuncts. And I would argue that it's not just administrators that have issues with this, it's faculty because they have to cede some of their own power and maybe even I get the sense from faculty where they would feel really uncomfortable or feel like they were giving up their expertise if they were having to work alongside someone who was coming or who was from the field. And I think oftentimes, some of our greatest teachers are adjuncts because they're coming in from the field. They're living it. They are absolutely in the trenches doing the work, and they're able to show how it is applied. And even, often I get questions about my work in India when I take students there for 3 weeks. My first couple of days, I'm team teaching with one of their trainers. After that, pretty much the CRHP trainers are doing all the work, all of the training. They do get paid. They get uh, they get paid for doing that work, but I have to let go of my sort of power and privilege of being the faculty member over this course. And that doesn't bother me, but it definitely does bother some of my colleagues. And feeling like, how are they able to have such an impact? They don't have the same degree, they don't have the same, but they have the lived expertise. And so it becomes my responsibility to help them think about the theory when they're talking about the practice. How am I being the one to bridge that piece? And so, I think we see that even with faculty colleagues. It's not just administration who have a hard time having these bridges and shared partnerships with those who are in the field.
I mean,
No,
oh,
I,
sorry.
I just want to jump in. I think one of the areas would be great to look at is people's tenure promotion guidelines, because again, it gets right at the heart of how you define and communicate scholarship as an example. I know here at Binghamton we were able to get some new language in, but one of that we wanted to put in was something around co-creation of knowledge. I knew that would push it too far, but wanted to put it out there. It got re-edited by our faculty executive committee of the Senate to say something along the lines of co-creating projects or something like that. But I mean, I'm hoping we continue to push that. But I think to your point, Amanda, that's where it still rubs people. They can't imagine that you could co-create knowledge, let alone have co-learning take place in that context. That I think is an issue that higher ed has to deal with, even in the classroom, right? Let alone working in community-engaged partnership examples. But yeah, but thank you for bringing that up.
Matt, go ahead.
No, no, I was going to say, Mike, I thought you had something you wanted to share.
Well, and this may broaden the scope beyond what any of us have the power to do. But Amanda, to your points though, around on the one hand, I think of how business schools, it's like, oh, it's common. People with industry expertise, right, are allowed in. So in certain sectors, we do value that form of knowledge of doing. And so why is it that we don't value that form of knowledge in, say, the social sciences or in the humanities? Or the knowledge that our partners bring. And similarly, right, I do think about how, as you were saying, Barry, around faculty promotion, tenure, and so on. Um, and it makes me think about some of the grants, right? So how quickly some faculty, whether they had the choice or not, were willing to accept what our current federal administration is saying is teachable or not in the classroom anymore. And so there again, it's like, oh, but wait, you're willing to cede this power of the faculty in this case, but you're not willing to cede this power of the faculty in this other case. So I do think there's a piece of it around power and prestige to come back to that. And when I think it was, you all can correct me, the NIH grants, right, that said, well, you need to build in broader impacts. So if research funding has in it not just tenure promotion, but the research dollars, which is the big carrot for higher ed these days, right, had something in it about partnerships. And it always strikes me how through history, there are examples, like even with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission being able to fit in there this one clause about maximum participation allowable. Like, oh, so who are the folks now in those spaces who could potentially advocate for those broader impacts? I hope it's a former student of one of ours who's doing that, by the way. So that's kind of the long game, right? Is thinking about, are we educating alumni who will go on to hopefully serve if there continues to be a civil service in this country and have impacts there based on some of these transformative experiences they've had? I think we need a quicker timeline than that. But that's one of the longer game hopes that I have.
I'm so glad you said that, Mike, because that's something that I think about a lot is that, and I guess I'm just enough of a pessimist to be like, I don't know that I'm going to radically frame shift the minds of the, folks that are above me right now, but like, yeah, some of the people that I'm teaching hopefully are going to be in those chairs in like 20 or 30 years. And so, progress is slow, but moves ever forward. And maybe that's how we do it. I don't know. I guess we've got about 6 minutes left, and we can continue this conversation however we like. But I did want to at least take a moment just to offer a chance. Is there anything that you all who are still here would want to ask Amanda and I, or is there any way in which she and I might be resources to you based on our own experience as we think about this work? And if not, that's totally cool, and we can just continue the conversation. But I wanted to make sure that we had a chance to get that out there as an opportunity.
Hey everyone, I just want to quickly introduce myself. I'm Gehenna. It was lovely to hear everyone talk and like have this conversation in a space where I usually tend to have it with like high school students, but it's great to hear like people on like higher levels on more global platforms kind of holding space for these discussions. So I just wanted to chime in real quick and say hi.
Thank you so much.
I just had one quick comment. Amanda, you kept talking about, what's it mean to be mutually beneficial? And I kept trying to get in the semantics of it. Usually that follows up with what reciprocity. It's reciprocal relationships. And those are different things. And so when it comes to assessing with community partners, ideas of being mutually engaged, mutually beneficial, reciprocal relationships, definitions of equity, which is different than equality. And so again, I would just, for future conversation, it'd be interesting just in terms of how we can frame the Matt's also perspectives, how we frame that upstream, downstream, whatever direction we're going in terms of doing it kinds of assessment, just in terms of the language that we're actually using.
And that language changes, right? Based on who you're working with, but also the context of that relationship. I mean, when I'm working in India, the language is definitely different. And yet we do talk about things that are mutually beneficial, but reciprocity, not so much. Or, even just breaking that down to like, what does that mean for me and what does that mean for you? But I think that even happens in my local partnerships as well. But thinking about what do they want, because sometimes it's not the things that they want aren't mutually beneficial. And so I think I find that to be also interesting as well, like understanding what that community partner really, really wants becomes important.
That's making me think that both that question and Amanda, your response I'm thinking about this topic of dialogue, right? How we dialogue, in what ways we dialogue, how we shift our dialogues based on the context, right? It feels like that's a thread that's come up again and again in this conversation. So I'm pinning it, Matt, for us to think about and for the community benefits group to think about, but also for all of us, I think, right? Like, I mean, is assessment just functionally dialogue? And how formal do we have to be? And how come sometimes stories don't, which are dialogues, a form of dialogue, how come they don't count for our institutions, right? Like, I don't know. I just feel like dialogue as a way, particularly then there's political dialogue and dialogue across different, dialogical assessment. I don't know. I feel like that's a thread that kind of has popped up throughout this conversation that, at least in my mind, I haven't done enough thinking about. So I thought about dialogue in a programmatic perspective, but how do we think about it in that way? So thanks to everybody for making me think more. And also, like, maybe that's something we need to kind of continue to work on as we're pushing this forward.
And I was just going to jump in and say, being cautious not to have it merge with workings going on around civil dialogue, because that's a very different thing.
Yeah.
But I think administrators starting to not quite see that distinction. Yes, we want to train our students to know this, viewing community engagement, et cetera. But I think there's now, in a lot of places now, civil dialogue is somehow replacing DEI work, but it's not the same thing. And so, I didn't mean to parse out the semantics of talking about dialogical assessments or dialogue, but I think as like in our center, which is really way before it's been more popular, but sort of moving towards having these civil dialogue conversations in the classroom and helping engage that happening. I'm thinking from an administrative perspective, I can see them conflating a lot of these things together. What we mean by conversations and dialogue. Oh, you mean having like civil dialogue? No, it's about having narratives and conversations about outcomes of our experiences. So anyway, I'm just bringing that up because I see that already happening where I'm at. I think this conflation of some of these terms are happening now. But anyway, just want to.
And I think, I don't want to conflate, but I also want to think about maybe if that's back to that conversation that Patrick was bringing up about, like, we have two, like, what might be resonating with our leaders. Is there a way that we can continue to build, right? Not conflate, but build on or continue. I don't know. Yeah, but it's a really good point, Barrett.
And I think it speaks to a point maybe Mike had brought up earlier, is that, like, the powers that be want the numbers. They don't necessarily care about the context. They're not as interested in the dialogue. And so how do we make that story what is important to them, and less about those numbers? Or how do we craft those numbers into that dialogue in a way that tells the richness of the work that we are doing? It's challenging, right?
And I see we're at time, so I want to make sure that we finish off here so everyone can move on to their next appointment. So thank you everyone for attending today. You can certainly reach out to me via email with any questions that you have. Amanda Whitman, myself, Mike Bishop, and some others are part of as we mentioned earlier, a collaborative working group that's trying to suss a lot of these issues out. So if anyone has any breakthrough ideas or questions, reach out to one of us and we can incorporate that in our work as well. So thank you again, everybody, and I'll see you soon.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all. So fabulous.
Have a great rest of your day.
Bye.
Really good to see everyone. Bye.